Thank you for staying with us. This is BizCheck. My name is Betty Kiptum. Now, we want to have a conversation on matters nuclear energy production in Kenya, and the government plans to inject about 4,000 megawatts to the national grid by 2034 from nuclear power. The Kilifi County and Kwale have been earmarked for construction of power plants, and the one that will be constructed soon, if the process sails, is the Kilifi power plant. And we just want to have a conversation with Laura Muniafu, who is a sustainable energy management expert, as well as Joyce Keingati, who is a community action for nature conservation expert. Of course, we are informed that there have been some issues from the Kilifi County residents, of course, seeking to understand the impact of this particular project to the environment and to their livelihoods. And we just want to understand what are those concerns, and if they should, or rather, prevent the implementation of the project. Thank you very much, ladies, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. 500 billion shilling nuclear plant set for construction in Kilifi County. Concerns have been raised, yeah? I would first of all like to hear from you, Laura, how we got here.
How we got here.
Right.
No, I think one of the things we have to recognize, we as a country have made commendable strides when it comes to our commitment to renewable energy, or rather to the energy transition. When people are preparing for the energy transition, I think we are currently right in the middle of the transition, because we're actually implementing clean energy sources. And it's very commendable to see that 90% of our energy comes from clean energy sources, being geothermal, solar, wind, and hydro. And it's so interesting that even as we think about nuclear, you have to recognize that nuclear energy is one of the clean energy sources. So in terms of us sticking true to our commitment of clean energy, we have stayed true to the cause. One of the things that you have to realize is, I know the question is there a need to develop nuclear energy now? And the reality is, as long as there's going to be a growing demand, there's always going to be a need to generate power that will meet that demand. And you don't generate power now, you start planning before. That's the value of having energy demand planners. And we have to recognize that not just here, but also within the continent, the population is growing significantly. It is expected that there is about 600 million people living in urban centers or cities, and that's going to double within the next 30 years, as we heard from the previous guest. In fact, it is expected that almost 70% of the population here in Kenya is going to be living in urban centers. And that means there's going to be a growing need for the critical infrastructure, being energy, transport, and water. So when it comes to the transport, the energy scenario, it's very important to envision a variety of adverse events, and create and choose technology which is resilient for those kinds of adverse events. And I think that's the value of taking into consideration a fairly stable source of power, such as nuclear energy. Secondly, putting up infrastructure. I think they've been doing quite a bit of work since 2010, which makes sense in terms of putting up infrastructure takes out time. There's a lot of time that is required to do the groundwork, where there's community engagement, social license to operate, getting the land to be able to build the power plant, and also getting the permits. So I think it's good enough in terms of the work that has been done as we prepare to have our first nuclear energy power plant in 2034.
Right. Laura Muniafu, conservationist. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much. As my colleague has said, the need for energy will keep on growing as long as the population is increasing. Mm-hmm. But coming from a conservation point of view, and really representing the communities on the ground that we work with, especially in Kilifi area, where it is one of the areas that has been earmarked, specifically in Uyombo, we feel that it is not the right move to make, considering the area that has been proposed. We could say it's a biodiversity haven. We have the Watamu Marine Park on one side, which is harbors a lot of biodiversity. We have the Arabuko Sokoke forest, where the community derive their livelihoods, where biodiversity is conserved, and the area basically is a UNESCO bioreserve. We have communities like small-scale fisheries communities who rely on the ocean, on the fisheries that are derived from the ocean to get their livelihood. We have the mangrove forest along the creek, the Mida Creek, and the conservation groups, which derive their livelihood from these natural resources. So at the end of it all, when we look at the conservation efforts that have been put in place to conserve the area, or rather to keep the area intact, we feel that having a plant in such a place is not good at all. So, and taking into consideration the communities who are there on the ground, who have been there since time immemorial, I would say that having a nuclear power plant there is not good at all. So from that background, thank you.
Joyce, as you listen to Laura speaking, of course, this is not secret information. It's out there that this area has very rich biodiversity.
Yeah.
So in the project planning phase, how is it done in a way that the biodiversity in the area will not be affected by, the construction of this plant and the production of the nuclear power there?
Okay. That's a fantastic question. I think there's a bit of work that NUPEA is still doing. It has started the initial work by creating the strategic environmental and social assessment, yeah. Which I think there's one that was recently published, and there's still a bit more work where they'll need to do further site characterizations, and then of course the attendant requirements of doing the environmental impact assessments. So in terms of them settling specifically on that site, I think there's quite a bit of work. It's one of the sites which they have selected based off the criteria, the broad criteria that there's a low population, it's next to a large water body, and also the ground. It's fairly stable there. They could have looked at Turkana, they could have looked at Nyanza, they could have looked at all the sides of the regions. But just based off that criteria, I think Turkana is closely linked to the Rift Valley, and same as Lake Victoria, so those were not necessarily the viable sites. Okay. In terms of Kilifi being, it's still a site that has not been definitive. There's still further work that they actually need to do to make, in terms of site characterizations, to actually say that this is actually where we're going to put this up.
All right,
yes.
so just hold that thought there. We would like to take a quick break to pay our bills. When we come back, this conversation continues. Before we took the break, we were talking about the concerns that the community has in terms of the biodiversity that that Joyce had mentioned. And Laura, you were telling us about just the steps that are taken in the pre-planning phase, to ensure that this biodiversity is maintained. Please go ahead with your point.
Thank you once again. I think one of the things that's very important is to just recognize that there's quite a bit of work that's been done, a bit of groundwork that is preparing towards putting up this power plant. First of all, we have to recognize that even for Kenya to be given the green light, this is one of the highly regulated sectors world over by the International Energy and Atomic Agency. So there's certain conventions that are required to ensure the safeguarding of the environment, as well as just ensuring safety and security, which also look at early warning and assistance in the event of an accident, and also the proper waste management and disposal. And so to that regard, the work that has started has been the strategic environmental and social assessment that has already been carried out by NUPEA. And of course, there will be subsequent attendant work that will have to be done in terms of having comprehensive environmental impact assessments, which need to be put in place before the project is even approved for construction. So there's a bit of groundwork that has started, and just to mention, just over and above that, I think another thing that's very, very important, that is, even as they're having the CESA and the environmental impact assessments, it's very important to recognize that we need to have adequate public participation. It is important for the simple reason that some huge energy infrastructure projects sometimes have actually had to come to a halt because there's not adequate public participation, especially when it came to the EIA. Good examples are the Lamu coal energy power plant that was to be put in place, which unfortunately had to be shelved because there's not adequate public participation when it came to the EIA. So I would encourage NUPEA to actually be transparent in terms of the communication, and also just ensure that they actually do the most when it comes to engaging the public to allay their fears.
Joyce, as NUPEA is carrying out all these public participation forums, what is the feeling of the locals in terms of the efficiency of the public participation forums, and also public information, ensuring that the public have the information they need to make sober decisions?
All right, thank you very much. So as my colleague has said, public participation is really important, and many a times we have seen that public participation is where people just come up in a forum and tell people that a certain program is coming, a certain development is coming. The one way, the very first stage of public participation or community engagement or stakeholder engagement, which is informing. So as she has said, it is important for NUPEA to really conduct really good public participation, or let's say community engagement or stakeholder engagement, because down there with the communities, first of all, they do not understand what this thing is all about. When you talk about nuclear program, when you talk about the nuclear power plant, it is a very green area for them. So the understanding of this whole thing is actually not vested in them. Secondly, when it comes to engagement, there are various levels of engagement. The very first one is informing people that something is coming, for them to actually know and get this information. Then there is the second aspect of consultation, where after information, there's the feedback, where the people really get to give the feedback in terms of how do they feel about these developments, in terms of the impacts that are to be foreseen, how do they feel about them. And the consultation moves further to embed this feedback into the development and improving, maybe the design of the project at all. So I'd say that there's a lot to be done when it comes to public participation and community engagement. There's a lot to be done when it comes to capacity and sharing of information when it comes to this whole nuclear power and the nuclear power program. And basically for the people to understand, so that when it comes to making a decision whether they would like this project to be in that area, because at the end of the day, the community has, or the citizens of the country have the sovereign power. So they need to have the information so that they can make an informed decision, so that we can have that we call social license or social acceptance of a project. So there's so much to be done, and I'd say adequate public participation has not been achieved.
Has not been achieved. Yeah. Laura, how can we ensure that both parties, are happy at the end of this process? And is that even a possibility?
In terms of, just please elaborate.
The residents of the area that the plant is supposed to be constructed, they're complaining about the biodiversity, loss of source of income, their ancestral homes and all that. At the same time, the government wants to ensure that this project, sails through. So how can we reach to a point of concession where both parties are happy and the project kicks off as intended?
No, that's a very interesting question, and I think it's always a very difficult and tough balance that any, running from the decision maker has to make in terms of, is it for the good of the project? Are we securing energy futures for our country, for the short, medium, and the long term? But the way I say it, I believe that this is not necessarily a bad project. We are looking at the growing demand, or rather the growing population, and based off that, we always will have to have a healthy and diverse energy mix. I had mentioned something around adverse events. And they're becoming more and more common based off the fact that we have climate change, adverse weather events from drought, famine, and floods. And when you look at those adverse events, if you're considering, say, hydro, I think there's only very few places that now we can either start putting up dams anymore. So hydro over some time will no longer be plausible option for a future energy source. Then when you look at solar and wind, it also has its limitations unless we can be able to advance some of the technologies such as battery energy storage technology, which is a fairly novel technology and a fairly costly technology. So if you're trying to look at a clean energy source of power and one that is also fairly stable and can give you huge amounts of power, I think nuclear is one of the considerations that can be taken into play. And the thing that we have to recognize is, I know most people are usually looking at the big nuclear power plants that are actually, they require space, or rather they would take up a space of maybe an 8-kilometer radius. That's going to be demanding a huge chunk of land. But the consideration that Kenya is taking into play is one that is fairly efficient in terms of the size. They are looking at the compact technologies that are there, the small nuclear reactors, which tend to be relatively costly, relatively cheaper than the conventional nuclear energy power plants. And also they tend to be take up less land. So if you're looking at the numbers right now for the kind of power plant that they're looking at, in fact, even the pilot one, I think it is considered as going to take up, the one that they're looking at in Konza City is going to take up about 34 acres of land, which if you were to consider like a solar power plant that was going to produce the same amount of power, it would take a considerably bigger amount of land. You'd be looking at maybe 10 times the acreage, or even actually thousands of acres, or even wind. That would be the same kind of consideration. So if you're looking at that kind of consideration, I think nuclear in terms of efficiency tends to be much more a much better option. In terms of the concerns, definitely there will always be concerns around the biodiversity, and definitely to allay those things you need to have what we already mentioned, the comprehensive impact assessments to assure and also adequate public participation to ensure that you have the community buy-in, that you also take into account that the people's perspectives in terms of the kind of measures that you're proposing to mitigate the potential risks, and also just giving people that comfort that you're going to ensure preservation of their biodiversity. But like I mentioned, in terms of adverse events, incidences that have happened in the past, out of the around 400 nuclear reactors world over, there's only been 3 significant events. So if you were to do that ratio in terms of the number of incidence rates or number, of the risk you realize that it's fairly low compared to like the incidences you'd observe when it comes to hydro, or the incidences that you observe in wind and solar.
All right. I'd like to get your thoughts on what she said, especially in terms of the risks that are involved for the community.
Thank you very much. Well, risks will always be there. And for the community, and coming from a conservation point of view, you know, we are very heavy in preserving the environment. We are very passionate in preserving and taking care of the environment. Negative impacts when it comes to radioactive waste that is generated out of the nuclear reactors. How will the disposal be made? You know, we're struggling with waste, domestic waste as a country, you know. So sometimes you ask yourself, so what about the radioactive waste? When it comes to displacement of people, you know, where are they going to be made? Sometimes we've heard of instances of I'd say unjust displacement, or displacement that was not done in the right way, resettlement rather. When it comes to the loss of livelihood, you know, when you put people from one place to another, are you assured that they're going to continue with their way of life? You know, what happens to that? When it comes to issues of culture, what happens to that? So I'd say it is important that we outweigh these impacts and really ask ourselves, really, do we really need this form of energy right now as a country, as much as the country is gearing up and putting the preparatory measures, the laws, the conventions to ratify the technical and expertise to operate and maintain the plant. So it is really a key question to ask ourselves, do we really need nuclear power? As she has talked about, that it is one of the forms of energy that is really clean, yes, because of its low carbon footprint, but the disaster, I mean, it is felt for a lot of years. You know, the Fukushima incident, we're still feeling the disaster right now. So it is really a critical question to ask ourselves and to really interrogate before we really decide to take that next step.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. I think I wish we had more time. This is a conversation that cannot really end any soon. So thank you for your thoughts. I will take those as your closing remarks. We have been talking about nuclear energy development. Laura Muniafu, sustainable energy management expert, as well as Joyce Keingati, community action for nature conservationist. Thank you very much for your thoughts, ladies. We want to take you now to your University of Nairobi, where there is a management change over there. The new Vice Chancellor is speaking currently. Let's listen into that.